The morning of the 7th day of June in 1944 brought a sight that would fundamentally alter how one German soldier understood the nature of modern combat. Standing in a concealed position not far from the small Norman town of Sainte-Mère-Église, Klaus Müller held the rank of Obergefreiter in the 709th Infantry Division, and what passed before his eyes during those early hours defied every briefing he had received about American military capabilities. The vehicles kept coming, one after another, in what seemed like an unbroken mechanical river flowing from the beaches toward the interior of France. He made marks in his notebook, counting each one, and when 2 hours had elapsed, the tally stood at 117 identical military reconnaissance cars. Each machine appeared pristine, as though it had been manufactured that very morning and driven straight from some distant assembly line to this Norman countryside. What struck Müller most profoundly was not merely the vehicles themselves, but what they represented. These were the machines Americans called jeeps, and they had crossed an entire ocean by the thousands. Their presence on French soil in such staggering numbers communicated something far more terrifying than the explosions of artillery shells or the rattle of machine gun fire. The Wehrmacht was not engaged in battle with a conventional military force, but rather with an entire industrial apparatus that had somehow transformed the ancient craft of warfare into something resembling factory production on a massive scale. The fundamental assumptions upon which German military planning rested were crumbling before his eyes, vehicle by vehicle. The invasion's first wave had brought these jeeps ashore, rolling directly off the ramps of landing ship tanks that materialized from the English Channel in what appeared to be infinite succession. Intelligence reports would later confirm that a single LST possessed the capacity to transport 30 fully assembled jeeps, and the number of these vessels depositing their cargo onto the Norman beaches ran into the hundreds. The markings stamped on each vehicle identified their origin as either Willis Overland Motor Company, located in Toledo, Ohio, or Ford Motor Company from Dearborn, Michigan. Military documentation designated them as truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance, but to the German defenders witnessing their arrival in such overwhelming quantities, they signified something altogether more ominous. These machines were tangible evidence of an industrial capacity that existed on a scale beyond German comprehension. Werner Lindemann commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment with the rank of Hauptmann, and his after-action report composed on the 9th of June in 1944 captured the disorientation German officers felt when confronted with American material abundance. He wrote that the enemy possessed vehicles in quantities that the Wehrmacht reserved for individual ammunition rounds. American military organization appeared to provide motorized transport down to the squad level, a degree of mechanization that seemed absurd by German standards. His company had destroyed 12 of the American reconnaissance cars in combat the previous day, a success that should have degraded enemy mobility in that sector. Yet when morning arrived, he counted 40 of the vehicles operating in that same area. The Americans treated complex military machinery the way German forces treated rifle cartridges, as disposable items to be expended and replaced without particular concern. Had German military planners possessed access to the actual statistics of American Jeep production, the figures would have seemed beyond belief. American factories manufactured more than 640,000 Jeeps during the period from 1941 through 1945. During peak production periods, the assembly lines at Willis Overland and Ford were completing one vehicle every 90 seconds. This single vehicle type alone represented fully 1/4 of all motor transport production for the American military. Germany, by contrast, had managed to manufacture barely 50,000 Kubelwagens throughout the entire duration of the war. The mathematical disparity was so extreme that German officers could not construct a mental framework to accommodate it. American production achieved this scale through standardization that exceeded anything German military culture had developed. Every Jeep rolling off the assembly lines, regardless of whether Willis or Ford had built it, utilized completely interchangeable components. A transmission salvaged from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB within minutes, with no modifications required. Wheels, engines, axles, and even the smallest components such as spark plugs and fan belts were identical across all production runs and both manufacturers. The standardization extended throughout the entire supply system, where spare parts were pre-positioned based on statistical analysis of component failure rates, ensuring that replacement parts were always available precisely where and when they would be needed. Hans Richter served as Feldwebel in the 716th Static Infantry Division, and his diary entries provide a ground-level perspective on American maintenance practices. From a concealed observation position near Carentan, he watched American operations and recorded his astonishment. The Americans, he noted, did not repair their vehicles in any conventional sense. Instead, they simply replaced broken components with new ones drawn from what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply. He observed a damaged vehicle returned to full operational status in less than an hour. The engine had not been repaired through careful diagnosis and correction of the specific problem. Rather, the entire engine was unbolted, lifted out, and a fresh engine installed in its place, performed as casually as changing a tyre. German mechanics would require a full week to execute such an operation, and it would demand a workshop with proper equipment. The Americans accomplished the task in an open field, under sporadic artillery fire, while smoking cigarettes as though performing routine maintenance on a farm tractor. The German military mind operated according to traditions that emphasized careful preservation and maintenance of every piece of equipment. In Wehrmacht practice, a vehicle was assigned to a specific unit and its service life meticulously tracked through detailed documentation. Loss of a vehicle through negligence constituted grounds for court-martial. When mechanical problems arose, they were diagnosed with precision, and parts were carefully repaired or, when replacement parts were unavailable, manufactured by skilled technicians. The Kübelwagen, which served as Germany's equivalent to the American Jeep, required factory-trained mechanics for any significant maintenance or repair work. The entire system assumed scarcity and demanded careful management of limited resources. American principals operated from entirely different assumptions. Their planners had calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was 90 days, and they had structured their entire system around this projection. Rather than investing resources in elaborate repair facilities and training programs for skilled mechanics, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any possible loss rate. When a Jeep sustained damage beyond what could be repaired immediately in field conditions, it was stripped of any usable parts and then abandoned. A new vehicle would arrive within hours, or at most a few days, delivered by the endless convoys that maintained connection between the beaches and the advancing front lines. The Americans had eliminated the friction of logistics through overwhelming abundance. Otto von Schröder held the position of Chief of Staff for the 352nd Infantry Division with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and his personal correspondence captured the bewilderment German officers experienced. In a letter to his wife, he described how the Americans fought what he called a rich man's war. They expended vehicles with the same casualness that German forces expended ammunition. He recounted witnessing a Jeep strike a mine, an event that would constitute a significant loss in Wehrmacht accounting. The crew emerged unharmed, transferred their equipment to another vehicle that materialized within minutes, and continued their mission without interruption. The destroyed Jeep was pushed to the roadside and forgotten, abandoned as though it were trash. In the German army, such a loss would trigger reports, investigations, and weeks of bureaucratic effort to obtain authorization for a replacement vehicle. The Americans simply produced another one from their apparently infinite supply. By the 10th of June, American forces had successfully landed more than 12,000 vehicles in Normandy, with Jeeps forming the largest single category. These vehicles transformed battlefield dynamics in ways that German doctrine had not anticipated or prepared to counter. American reconnaissance units achieved penetration of German defensive lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility, appearing in locations that should have been secure. Artillery forward observers operating from jeeps could rapidly relocate their positions, making German counter-battery fire nearly impossible to coordinate effectively. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing combat forces, eliminating the pauses for consolidation and resupply that German commanders had expected to exploit for counterattacks. The jeep's mechanical capabilities compounded the difficulties German forces faced. With four-wheel drive and relatively low weight, it could traverse terrain that German planners had categorized as impassable for vehicles. The Norman Bocage country, with its maze of sunken roads and thick hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicles into predetermined kill zones that German forces had prepared to defend. Instead, jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, and around obstacles. They created their own improvised road network, operating independently of the mapped routes that German defensive planning had assumed would constrain enemy movement. Hans von Luck commanded a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division with the rank of Oberst, and his post-war writings provide valuable insight into German tactical frustration. The jeep, he explained, gave every American unit the mobility that German forces had achieved only with their elite mechanized formations. A single vehicle could transport a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies interchangeably. They appeared everywhere, in places German commanders had considered secure, bringing firepower or summoning artillery through their radio equipment. German forces could not establish a continuous front line because the Americans simply drove around defensive positions, rendering static defense obsolete. The maintenance and supply system supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming to German observers. American logistics units had prepared for operations on an industrial scale that German military culture had never attempted. Ships arrived daily, carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles, spare engines, transmissions, and prepackaged component sets. Mobile workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, equipped to perform any repair or replacement operation. If a unit lost 10 jeeps in combat, 10 replacements would arrive within 48 hours, often less. The Americans had industrialized military logistics to a degree that seemed to violate natural laws. Heinrich Zimmermann served as major in the 12th SS Panzer Division, and his observations cut to the heart of the systemic difference. The American supply system, he noted, operated like a factory production line extended directly to the battlefield. Everything was standardized, packaged, and delivered according to schedule. They had removed the friction from warfare that Clausewitz had described as inherent to military operations. While German forces struggled to maintain their existing equipment through improvisation and careful husbandry, Americans simply ordered replacements as though selecting items from a commercial catalogue. The psychological impact of this disparity proved devastating to German morale. Within days of the invasion, the psychological effects on German forces became evident and significant. Soldiers who had been repeatedly told through propaganda that Americans were soft and dependent on material comfort discovered instead an enemy who possessed material abundance on a scale beyond imagination. The sight of endless columns of identical jeeps, each one new and fully equipped, demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance undermined the ideological foundations that were supposed to sustain German fighting spirit. Wolfgang Braun worked as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, holding the rank of Gefreiter, and he examined captured jeeps to understand their construction. His report revealed the philosophical difference in engineering approach. Every component was designed specifically for mass production and easy replacement. The engine was simple in design but adequate for its intended purpose. The transmission was built for robustness rather than refined performance. Nothing was polished or precisely fitted according to traditional engineering standards, yet everything functioned with reliable effectiveness. The Americans had deliberately sacrificed engineering elegance for quantity, and quantity was proving sufficient to win the war. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers who had been indoctrinated in the racial ideology promoted by the regime's leadership. African American soldiers drove jeeps, maintained them, and supervised motor pools with evident competence. This challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness that formed core elements of the regime's worldview. Kurt Wagner, serving as Feldwebel, noted with evident bewilderment that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. The racial theories he had been taught suggested this should be impossible, yet the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. The ideological framework was colliding with observable reality. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated a flexibility that German military culture could not accommodate within its rigid command structure. Within days of landing, American units were welding additional armor plate to protect against small arms fire, installing wire cutters to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads, mounting multiple machine guns for increased firepower, and adapting vehicles for specialized roles that had not been anticipated in original planning. Medical units converted jeeps to ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment for mobile communications. Engineers mounted mine detectors for route clearance. Each modification was crude by German engineering standards, but immediately effective in solving tactical problems. The contrast with German equipment became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed through June and into July. Wehrmacht vehicles required specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts manufactured to precise specifications, and trained mechanics with years of experience. Many German units continued to rely on horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. The horses were vulnerable to artillery fire, required constant care and veterinary support, and limited mobility to walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance administered by any soldier with minimal training was profoundly demoralizing to German troops struggling with obsolescent logistics. By the 15th of June, German intelligence analysts estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving daily through the continuous stream of supply ships. This number seemed impossible to officers who remembered that the entire German army invading Poland had deployed with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics of American production capacity suggested that the United States could lose every vehicle currently in Normandy and replace them all within 2 weeks of production. The implications of this calculation were staggering. Ernst Wagner compiled a detailed report for the Panzer Lehr Division with the rank of colonel, and this analysis reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury in an air attack. The report stated plainly that German forces faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree never before imagined possible. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles using the same methods they employed to manufacture civilian automobiles for the consumer market. Every American soldier seemed to know how to drive and perform basic maintenance, reflecting a society where automobile ownership was widespread. Their entire society was mobilized for mechanical warfare in ways that Germany had never achieved and perhaps could not achieve given its different social and economic structure. The disparity in production philosophy proved unbridgeable through any tactical or operational adaptation. German vehicles like the Kubelwagen were well-engineered products, carefully constructed by skilled workers and designed for longevity and reliability. But German industry could produce only a few dozen per day at peak capacity. American jeeps were simple in design, crude by German engineering standards that valued precision, but they rolled off assembly lines at rates that Germany could not match even if all its factories were combined and dedicated solely to this task. Where German industry sought perfection in each individual product, American industry sought adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numbers. The strategic implications favored the American approach. Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division with the rank of General Major, and his assessment proved brutally honest. German forces were fighting the last war while the Americans fought the next one. Germans perfected individual vehicles, while Americans perfected the industrial system that produced vehicles in quantity. Germans trained specialist mechanics through years of apprenticeship, while Americans designed vehicles that any soldier could maintain with minimal instruction. The metaphor he employed was stark. Artisans were fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line was winning through sheer productive capacity. The redundancy built into the American system frustrated German tactical planning at every level. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineers appeared within hours, carrying portable bridging equipment transported on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little military benefit when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared within hours to resume the same mission. Mining roads only caused Americans to drive through fields, creating new routes that bypassed prepared defensive positions. Every German tactical success was negated by American material abundance that could absorb losses and continue operations without interruption. The Jeep transcended its military function to become a symbol of American abundance that German soldiers found both amazing and demoralizing. German soldiers filed reports describing jeeps used for tasks that would have been unthinkable in Wehrmacht practice. Delivering mail to forward positions, transporting journalists to observe combat operations, carrying chaplains to conduct religious services, even moving generals' personal baggage. This casual use of military equipment for convenience rather than strict necessity demonstrated a wealth that German soldiers, accustomed to perpetual scarcity and careful preservation of every resource, found almost incomprehensible. Friedrich Hoffmann wrote to his family with the rank of lieutenant, attempting to explain what he was witnessing. The Americans used their vehicles the way Germans used bicycles, for everything and without particular concern for wear and tear. He had observed a jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel merely for the comfort of 3 men. In the German army, those men would walk to collect their rations and eat cold food to conserve resources. This apparent wastefulness should constitute a weakness, but when one could waste without consequence due to overwhelming abundance, it became a form of strength that was difficult to counter. The technological gap manifested in unexpected ways throughout daily operations. American jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits containing everything needed for field maintenance, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper that any soldier could follow, and spare parts packages calculated through statistical analysis of failure rates. German vehicles often lacked even basic tools, relied on mechanics' accumulated experience and expertise rather than written documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex requisition system that could require weeks to process even urgent requests. As June transitioned into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility across the battlefield. Static defensive positions were outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that identified weak points and bypassed strong points. Artillery positions were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry before they could displace to alternate positions. Supply lines were severed by fast-moving patrols that appeared behind German lines, struck their targets, and disappeared before reserves could respond to the threat. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that inherently favored the side possessing unlimited motorized transport. Wilhelm von Steuben observed American breakout preparations in late July with the rank of major, and his written analysis proved prescient. The Americans had achieved something Germans had considered impossible: the complete motorization of an entire army. Every soldier could be moved by vehicle rather than marching on foot. Every artillery piece could be towed at highway speed rather than limited to the pace of horses. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the unit that needed it rather than requiring elaborate intermediate depots. German forces were fighting a 19th century war against an enemy waging 20th century warfare. The German High Command's various attempts to counter American motorization proved universally futile. Orders to prioritize targeting vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were distributed everywhere throughout the enemy force. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation that allowed it to function independently. Strategic plans to exploit American dependence on fuel supplies were negated by a logistics system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany had not possessed even during the victorious campaigns of 1940 when fuel was relatively abundant. By the time Operation Cobra launched in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps comprising the single largest category. German intelligence estimates, compiled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance, suggested the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and still remain more thoroughly motorized than any German division at full authorized strength. This calculation, when reported through channels to Berlin, was dismissed by staff officers as defeatist thinking. The assessment was actually conservative and understated American capabilities. The influence of American motorization extended far beyond immediate military impact on the battlefield. German officers who survived the war would carry these lessons forward into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and designed simplicity would profoundly influence German industrial development in subsequent decades. The Volkswagen, which had failed as the Kübelwagen to compete with the Jeep in war, would succeed as the Beetle in peace by applying the mass production principles that Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly during the conflict. Otto Schultz spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in America after his capture, and his post-war reflection captured the fundamental lesson. In Normandy, German forces learned that modern war was not primarily about courage or tactical skill, but rather about industrial capacity and productive efficiency. The Americans demonstrated that victory belonged to whoever could produce the most, ship the fastest, and replace losses immediately without degradation of combat capability. The Jeep was not merely a vehicle in military terms, but rather a symbol of a new kind of warfare that Germany had not been prepared to wage or counter effectively. The historical episode of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents something more significant than a simple military mismatch or tactical disparity. It was fundamentally a collision between two different civilizations' approaches to warfare and military organization. The Germans, operating within their tradition of professional military excellence and carefully maintained equipment, encountered an American military force that had transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production on a scale previously unimagined. In the final analysis, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across Normandy throughout June and July represented something more profound than military vehicles serving tactical purposes. They were the physical manifestation of what had been called the arsenal of democracy, concrete proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations and planning assumptions completely obsolete. For German soldiers watching those columns advance day after day, each individual jeep served as a messenger bearing the same simple truth. The age of artisan warfare had definitively ended, and the age of industrial warfare had begun. Ernst Bergmann observed American operations throughout the entire Normandy campaign with the rank of Hauptmann, surviving to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany, and his final assessment deserves the concluding word. The Americans taught German forces that in modern war the factory is more important than the battlefield itself. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers with each one identical and replaceable, demonstrated that warfare had become a branch of industry rather than a profession of arms. Germans thought they were soldiers engaged in combat. The Americans showed them they were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and the American factory was infinitely larger and more efficient than anything Germany could construct or operate.